So our next presentation is from Mike Free from the FAA, talking about the FAA's role and what's learned.
Would like to thank the panel for the opportunity to come and give an overview of the FAA and some data points around the FAA's mission, the data the FAA provides to provide the framing of what are the surveillance systems that we can bring to bear, or there's data around those sensors, as well as to frame the limitations of those. I know Sean talked about some of the data points that are used and being integrated, so hopefully this will give you an overview of the FAA's mission as well as those data points. Next slide, please. So the FAA's mission is quite large and complex. By a factor of 2, we operate more commercial aircraft than any other country. I think we're second only to Australia in total airspace, but largely because Australia has a very large oceanic volume that they're responsible for managing. So it is a very complex, very large national airspace system. We have over 14,000 controllers, 520 air traffic control towers, which are located at the highest density of airports, and I'll refer to those as towers in subsequent slides. We have 147 what we call terminal radar approach controls, or TRACONs, and those are manned control facilities at the high and medium density airports around the nation, as well as 21 air route traffic control centers, which manage the control of air traffic in the en route environment. There's over 19,000 airports, over 5,000 of those are associated public airports, with the remaining 14,000 plus private airports. Next slide, please. So the FAA's mission is primarily around safe and efficient control of manned aircraft. That has been our historical mission, and it remains our primary mission. Certainly as we talk about new entrants with UASs and advanced air mobility and some of those things, there will be an evolution of the FAA's mission to include safe operation of the NAS with those new entrants. But the architecture and design of the NAS is geared around safe and efficient control of aircraft and manned aircraft. Certainly the commercial aspect, the commercial flights are a primary focus of the agency. We certainly support general aviation and flights as well. But again, our mission is around manned aircraft and safe and efficient operation of those. By the numbers, over 16 million flights yearly, 5,400 flights at peak at the peak time of any given day, 45,000 daily flights, 25 million GA flight hours per year. A very large, very complex operation that we're responsible for managing. We certainly provide a significant contribution to that service to the nation in the form of product toward a GDP. Next slide. So as we get into the discussion of surveillance services, I want to provide a little bit of framework around the categorization of our surveillance services, and we primarily break those into two bodies. The cooperative surveillance, which is defined by a sensor that's avionics or equipment on board the aircraft that works in conjunction with ground-based sensors. The non-cooperative surveillance is independent. This is basically the classic radar. RF energy is transmitted out, reflects off the target, and we receive that signal, and from that return we can determine where that aircraft is. Typically these cooperative and non-cooperative sensors are co-located together, the cooperative mounted on top of the non-cooperative radar. So from a data perspective, I think in this panel, in this study, I think that the cooperative sensors, those are neither unknown or anomalous. So for the purposes of this briefing or the rest of this briefing, I'm going to focus on the non-cooperative aspect. Next slide, please. So again, from the standpoint of the mission of the FAA, around it, again, is primarily around manned aircraft, and I think that serves as an important framework for the data points and the type of data that we can bring to bear, for this panel. So we break our systems and the design of the systems into different types of systems. So we have short-range radars, which are typically located at the high and medium density airports. And those operate from a range. They have a detection range of between 40 and 60 miles and an altitude detection capability of about 24,000 feet. The long-range radar systems have a detection range of 2 to 250 nautical miles with altitude detection up to 100,000 feet. So that provides the basic the framework for those. I will mention the automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, or ADS-B, only from a context that does serve as a primary data source and a preferred data source for the management of the airspace system, but it is a cooperative system, and for the purposes of the next slides, as I get into the discussion of the coverage and the type of detection for those non-cooperative targets, it is not considered as part of those. And also surface surveillance is also something that we provide, but again, for the purpose of the study, I only include those for just a completeness perspective. The one final point, as I talk about manned aircraft and primary mission for the drones and balloons and things of that nature, their basic premise is to operate on a not to interfere basis, that they are not to interfere with manned operations. And that's a fundamental aspect as we talk to the data and what we can and can detect with respect to those non-manned systems. Next slide, please. Realizing this is an eye chart, I wanted to provide just a graphical or pictorial depiction of where our sensors are located. The green, blue, and pink balloons, if you will, represent our short-range radars. Those are located at airports. Those are where those are sited. The two reddish balloons, they have letters in them, a 4 and a C. Those represent our long-range radars, the ARSR 4s and CARSR systems that are used in the context of both from an air traffic control perspective as well as for a national defense and homeland security mission. And the perimeter, the ARSR 4s are located around the perimeter of the country, equally spaced, and the CARSR systems are located on the interior of the U.S. I will point out that this only depicts the CONUS. There are systems, ATC, both short-range and long-range systems, Hawaii, Alaska, and Caribbean. Those are not depicted here. I didn't think they were necessary for the purpose of understanding the surveillance. And I will also point out that both for this slide and the subsequent coverage slide, I do not talk to any classified DoD or DHA systems that are in operation. Okay, next slide, please. So what can the FAA detect and surveil, what can we not? This slide gives you a by altitude slice of what it is that we can detect. So if you look at the square that's labeled 1,000-foot AGL, that depicts by sensor for an aircraft that is 1,000 feet in altitude, what is the range at which we can detect that aircraft. And so on, as you get higher in altitude, or higher in altitude, you can detect it at further range. And that's basically a phenomenon of the curvature of the Earth and the line of sight aspect of these radar systems. So pretty good coverage across the U.S. at 10,000 feet and above. This is a mathematical model based of a pure line of sight as well as some geographical screening. As you can see in the western part of the U.S., there is screening due to the mountains and those sensors. Need to take a little bit of time and talk about the nature of the targets. These line of sight models represent an input of a target that is 1 square meter. So think of a sphere of 1 meter in diameter. That's the assumption that goes into these models. So if you think about that in the context of other forms or aircraft, A fourth generation F-15 or F-18 is in the proximity of about 1 square meter, perhaps a little bit larger. A large airliner is perhaps 100 square meters. A small UAS is perhaps a 0.01 square meter. So the range of these detections, or the size and the ability to detect these targets from an F-15 large airliner, 100 times larger in size, a drone 100 times smaller in size. So the detection and the surveillance capability really largely depends in part to the target that we're talking about and the ability to surveil that target. All right, next slide. So I do include this ADS-B coverage slide just to give a context of, from a cooperative perspective, there is very good coverage across the U.S. to 1,500 feet above ground level. So this provides a context of when we look at the data and start getting into discussion of what it is we can detect. This will certainly be, for those cooperative aircraft that have ADS-B, we could certainly detect those to a pretty low altitude across the U.S. All right, a couple of data points. I think I know Sean certainly talked about some of the data points, and I can provide a little bit of insight from an FAA perspective. Drones are a pretty significant challenge. There's 880,000 registered drones in the U.S. Small drones, I should say, Part 107 drones. Many tens of thousands of those are operated on a daily basis by commercial operators. It's not clear how many private drone operators are taking their drone up for a quick flight. But as I said earlier, those are regulated they're regulated to operate below 400 feet in altitude. So again, it's the drone aspect is for those small drones in particular, and as well as all classes of drones. There are regulatory restrictions to where they can and cannot fly, basically avoiding and not interfering with manned aircraft operations. Second data point, we talked about balloons. The Weather Service, we know on 92 weather stations that release balloons twice a day. At 6 a.m. and 0000 Zulu and 1200 Zulu. Typically 2-hour duration. They fly up to 100,000 feet where the envelope bursts and then the payload descends back to Earth. So certainly, at least 184 balloon flights daily in the NAS. Not to consider universities and hobbyist balloons that may be launched, but those are typically small in size. And finally, Sean did talk about UAPs and FAA data. A couple of data points that we do report. There is a process by which air traffic controllers can report UAP sightings or events. Historically, those have been in the range of about 3 to 5 reports per month that have been reported. We did see an uptick of reports in August of 22 that went up to about 8 to 10, perhaps due to Starlink launches. And finally, with the Chinese weather or the Chinese balloon incident in February, we did see a significant uptick, and there's like 68 UAP reports that started in February, and we've seen a large number, subsequent to that. I think that's all I had. Any questions?
Do you want to take the question? It's easy. Actually, you can choose the questioners. It's easy from your angle than from mine.
All right, Walter.
Yeah, so two questions about the radar data coverage. First one is, do you retain any of the data, or is it just cycled over as?
There is a retention, long-term retention of data. I can't recall exactly how long we retain that. There's certainly a requirement from a retention from a legal perspective. Yeah, exactly. But I do know there is some periodicity measured in a term of months.
Is it retained in terms of like the raw radar, or is some processed form of data that's retained?
I believe it's a process form of data that is what was displayed on the, whether it's an en route ERAM system or the STAR system.
And then the other question is for the radars, are they operated in any sort of a tasked mode, or are they constant search mode?
The current systems in our inventory, just they're fixed face, and they just rotate at either 12 RPM or 5 RPM, depending on whether it's an en route or a terminal surveillance requirement. All right, next question. Yes.
Mike, forgive me if you mentioned Sobre, but you said, like, I think you said 3 to 5 reports per month.
Per month.
Out of how many?
That is 3 to 5 reports per month for all of the controllers in all of the U.S. So there's a process by which if they see something and they want to report that, they can go to report that to the den, we call it, but report, hey, I saw something, I don't know what it was. So that's 3 to 5 per month across the entire, 14,000 controllers per month. So, 45,000 operations any given day, 30 days, however many days in a month, it's a very small percentage.
Can you describe actually about this? How do you encourage to report? Do you feel like the stigma on UAPs is impairing the reporting? Do you feel the reporting is biased?
I'm not aware of I'll answer it this way. The process by which UAP is reported is part of the air traffic controller order. So basically, the air traffic controllers are allowed. It says, if you see something, here's the process by which the procedure by which you would report it. Other than that, I'm not aware of any specific stigma or limitations, and I'm probably not in a good position to speak to that. Other than there is that process, and that is the process that we use, and is what represents those numbers I talked to.
And if I may have, I had a question prior to this one. How do you decide the sites where you deploy? You saw the map, and it has some very good coverage on the coastal areas. There were some areas of lack of coverage.
Yeah. So if you go back one slide from what's presented here, what you'll see is in the eastern half of the U.S. there's a lot better coverage, but that's because there's a lot more population in the east, and therefore a lot more airports. And these systems are historically sited at the airports in support of those airport operations. To the west, obviously, less dense and fewer systems. Now, that's from an ASR, the short-range radar perspective. The long-range radars are pretty much equally spaced in order to provide the maximum coverage from a homeland defense and security perspective, as well as with higher altitude flights, the en route cruise phase of air traffic control. Warren.
Mike, first, thank you and the FAA for coming to share this information with us. Second, can you speak to a little bit of the filtering techniques that we use? So with respect to, I know Walter had a question about the raw data and process, but can you just talk a little bit about, we actually aren't trying to detect everything.
That's actually a very good question and a very good point with respect to what we can and cannot see. So there are, the closer to the ground you point a radar, certainly you can get lower elevations, but you also start to see the effects of trees and other ground-based clutter, as we call it, that starts to interfere. So we have great ability to detect a lot of things, but from an FAA mission perspective, our desire is to find that sweet spot of seeing everything to as low an altitude as we can to maximize our mission around safe operations of manned aircraft. Now, to pull that thread just a little bit further, there's also limitation with respect to biologicals or insects and dust and things of this flavor that most aircraft fly above a certain speed. So we typically will have filtering settings on our systems to get rid of the stuff that really is leaves or insects or things of that nature, so that we provide as clean a display for the controllers. So there are specific settings that we can adjust, and it's been learned over many years to perfect those, what we call optimization of those kinds of filters, to get rid of what is not a manned aircraft, not an aircraft, and provide as clean a display for the controllers as we can. Yes? Please.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Would it be kind of following up on what you said, Warren? Would it be possible to collect the raw data and to save that? Because if it would be possible to do some calibration after the fact that Sean was mentioning, for example, you might be able to capture other phenomenology. Is that possible?
Well, when you say raw data, I think we'd have to talk a little bit about what is meant. So, you know, from a technical perspective, pure, what we would call INQ data is huge, you know, gigabyte, very, very, very large volumes of data. That would probably be cost prohibitive, and we certainly don't do that today. There are, again, we do record data, but it is effectively the data that has been through some form of these processings and these filterings. We do that today, but it certainly, with enough time and money, we could certainly collect that data, and I think it would be we'd have to look at the challenge of how we would go about modifying the systems or introducing new ways to collect that raw data as you described. Certainly it's feasible, it's possible, but it's not without technical challenge.
One other question on the
Yes.
184 balloon flights daily. Are those characterized, or you just know they do that and then they just end up where they are?
So under the balloon, I'll call it Part 101, the regulations for balloons, there's very specific requirements. So for National Weather Service, before they release those, they'll contact the local air traffic facility. They're going to say, here's what time I'm going to release it. And when they release it, they have tracking, and they provide that tracking to the air traffic control facility throughout the flight of you know, that particular balloon. There are commercial balloons that are also launched, but those for the most part, as I understand it, have they actually transmit their GPS position in support of where they're flying, so as to ensure they're not interfering with air traffic, and to ensure the air traffic controllers are aware of where those balloons are operating. Yes, ma'am.
So we've talked about reporting the 3 to 5 per month from air traffic control, but what about from the non-cooperative surveillance? Has there been anomalies from the sensors themselves? And if so, what is the process for that?
I'd say the FAA mission is not around anomalies with the non-cooperative sensors themselves. So as we build an air traffic control picture, we have both the non-cooperative systems, which detects the target. We have a cooperative system that also detects a target, and we will tend to merge those targets together. And so on a controller's display, they'll know, is this a non-cooperative only or a merged or combined target, so that they know, you know, basically an increased level of confidence that on what it is they're seeing is in fact a real aircraft. So we don't make any real distinction between a non-cooperative and a cooperative, other than how they get combined and put on a controller's display. So I don't know if that answered your.
Unregistered flight?
So like a GA flight that is flying visual flight rules, those will just be picked up by if they're not equipped with a cooperative avionics, those would just be picked up by the non-cooperative system that if they happen to surveil where that aircraft is flying. And so that certainly will be put on the controller's display, and they will be able to provide awareness. In fact, there's a flight following procedure by which GA pilots can ask for, hey, I'm not squawking, or I don't have a cooperative system, but please help me, and just via the radio, I'm going to go on from here to here and provide awareness, situational awareness, if the controller has the bandwidth to provide that data.
One last question.
Yes.
So I'm not a scientist, I'm a recovering attorney, and I love process. And a few questions there. If I'm a pilot, where do I find that process for reporting UAPs? Where is that articulated or captured? Second, when you mentioned that you're reporting these incidents, who are you reporting it to? And are those incidents, pulling on the thread that Reggie started, are they being archived anywhere?
I believe they are archived. They're reported to the domestic network, event network. It's an FAA organization or function. I can't speak to whether they would be, say, part of what Sean would include as part of his database. I presume so. So I think that was the answer to the second question. What was the first question again? I'm sorry.
Where does the reporting process live? If I'm a pilot, I see a UAP, where do I go to find out?
That I don't know the answer to that question. Like I said, I'm familiar with the reporting process from a controller perspective and the order that's used to define how controllers do their job. I am not. I don't know the answer to the question from a pilot perspective.
Gotcha.
Great. So thank you, Mike, for your presentation and for all the help the FAA has given us as we've been learning more about the very impressive system that the FAA maintains.
Thank you.
I know.
Thank you for having me.
You know, for me, one of the many takeaways from this is feeling, just a little bit safer every time I fly, and thankful for you and your colleagues for what they do to make that possible.
Thank you.
And we're now going to take a quick lunch break. We'll be back at 12:30. And